We will start today with a morning keynote with Dr. Imani Perry. Imani Perry is the Carol K. Forsheimer Professor at Harvard Radcliffe Institute and the Henry A. Morris Jr. and Elizabeth W. Morris Professor of Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality, and African American, and they did put this on 2 pages, so I'm sorry, studies at Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Sorry, totally messed that up, but we know that you work at Harvard and that you're brilliant. Perry is a scholar of law, literature, and cultural studies, and an author of creative nonfiction. Her writing and scholarship primarily focuses on history of Black thought, art, imagination crafted in response to and in resistance against the social, political, and legal realities of domination in the West. Her most recent book, the one that really blew my mind away, South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation, was written in 2022. And in that same year, she won the National Book Award for Nonfiction and was a New York Times bestseller. You're always a bestseller in my book, darling. She just recently was awarded the MacArthur Genius Fellowship Award. We are so honored to have you as a contributor to this catalog and, of course, as a morning keynote to this symposium. Please help me welcome Dr. Imani Perry.
Good morning. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. It is such an honor and delight to be able to be part of honoring the work of an artist who I consider a friend, Dawoud Bey, but also who is a constant inspiration. For those of you, there's some folks here who know me. It's also wonderful to be amongst friends and colleagues and so many people whose ideas inspire me, animate my work. One detail that was not in that bio that people who know me will know is very important, and of course I'm going to say something about it. I was born in Birmingham, Alabama. And it's an important, and I am an Alabama booster like no other. And so I'm going to begin, I'm going to begin there and then wind up here in Richmond where we are. In June of 1963, when John F. Kennedy Jr. announced the Civil Rights Bill that he planned to introduce to Congress, Fred Shuttlesworth, the fiery pastor and civil rights organizer of Birmingham, recalled that Kennedy said, "But for Birmingham, we would not be here today." And that sentence is often cited. It is titled books, it is in articles, and et cetera. And it's often recorded or referenced as a sign of victory of civil rights progress. But for Birmingham can cut in many different ways. On September 19th of 1963, 4 days after the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, Fred Shuttlesworth, Martin Luther King Jr., and several other organizers met with John F. Kennedy Jr. again at the White House. And on that day, King is quoted as having said, "The Negro feels that everywhere he goes, if he remains stationary, he's in danger of some physical violence." It feels resonant in ways that make me at least think that but for Birmingham, we would not be here is complicated. Hope and belief and endurance have all been tested. In 1963 was we were 100 years belated, and belatedness continues. And so we return, we rethink, we re-narrate. And that for me is central to what Dawoud's work opens up for us. And this is why I'm going back here today and remixing, right? Which is what the South, I think, always forces you to do. It challenges chronologies because our histories are always being relayered. And I had the great honor several years ago of writing about Dawoud's Birmingham Project and also speaking with him last year about it in Birmingham, Alabama as well. And I've also written about South's plural. And this gathering, I think, attests to a particular of those many Souths' significance. But to go back, right? So movement, one of the various things that I think we forget is the frequency of movement, even in the context of enslavement, that people were being moved up and down, as well as movement that was fugitive, engaged in fugitive movement. And then, of course, when we discuss the Great Migration, what is also often forgotten is that movement happened within the South, both in terms of migrant labor in the South, but also the movement from the rural to the urban South, like Birmingham, like Richmond. Birmingham was a migration destination founded in 1871, and through the first part of the 20th century, Black people arrived there seeking escape from fields and the harshest forms of physical labor, and yet found a place that was organized by a technology of domination, a place of dreams deferred. And yet they built, and they recorded themselves and their aspirations, their institutions, their rituals, as well as their tragedies. And so in the context of the Birmingham Project, Dawoud Bey's work stands in that tradition. And I want it to echo for us as we move into thinking about the slave trail and elegy engagement in general, right? Lamentation, as well as a recognition of the ways in which we are haunted. So just a bit of that context. So the Birmingham Project honors the tragedy of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, which killed 4 girls, and the subsequent upheaval in which 2 teenage boys were murdered. Each work in the series is a diptych. On one side is a child of the age of one of the 6 youths killed in the bombing and its aftermath. On the other side is an adult 50 years older, about the age the children would have been had they lived. The figures sit in twinned poses. Their arms matter, and so do their eyes. The arms announce a steadiness, a still here to history, which so often casts Birmingham in 1963 and forgets its present presence. The gaze is for them more than the viewer. Do not make of me a museum, but rather witness my witness, their eyes exhort. In early Christian traditions, diptychs often served as portable icons. One side would bear names of the living and the other of the departed, to be blessed in a local church and then carried around. In a sense, the photographs are the same, born at 16th Street and traveling to various exhibitions and collections, yet they are in other ways distinct, as both sides represent the living and both honor the dead. Their backdrop is Bethel Street Baptist Church, the one pastored by Fred Shuttlesworth, who was the primary leader of Birmingham's civil rights movement. And though the airport bears his name, and he is well known in Birmingham, he's not widely known across the nation and world. The choice of that location, as well as at the museum, the choice of Bethel in particular is an instruction. We still have so much to learn about the past and about how to pay attention, to attend. Right? Social movements are never singular endeavors. They team with dedication and a chorus of voices, and they are crossroads spaces. This, too, where we are, is a crossroads. We are seeing here in the exhibition more recent work of Dawoud's, but an older story, both a before and a continuation. It speaks to the cyclical nature of the uses of history, right? And that the uses of history, that is where the battle lies, not just telling what happened, but why it happened, right? A gaze, not just a glance to where we go from here. As such, the choice of location is extremely important. In 1788, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to James Madison, and in the letter, they had lots of letters. This one I'm talking about, he's sharing his scientific observations about light, color, and electrical fluid, and also about rainbows. And he says about his view at Monticello, approximately 70 miles from here, but close in tradition, I have seen a leg of a rainbow plunge down on the river running through that valley. But he says he's never seen the other side of that circle, right? You see one side of the arc of a rainbow, but you don't see the completion of that circle. And of course, in those words is the silent echo, the leg of a rainbow plunging, right? An echo of a body and a being seeking freedom. Jefferson and Madison observed and documented, though both lacked second sight, the kind of second sight that ensured my and many of our very existence. And I think we do well to try to not just to note the absence of that second sight, but to try to hold on to the tradition of the second sight today, and that is part of what we're experiencing in this exhibition. And I would add that means sight in the sense of senses, seeing, right? We're engaged with the visual, but sight in the sense of location, right? The places that must be returned to, attended to, gazed at a second time around, and a third and a fourth and a fifth, and so forth. As Solomon Northup wrote in 1853 in 12 Years a Slave, not by human dwellings, not in crowded cities alone are the sights and sounds of life. The wildest places of the earth are full of them. The wildest places of the earth are filled with history too. Which brings us to the slave trail. A glance or even a careful observation which Jefferson thought he made over much of this nation's history has woefully disregarded much of whom and what populated the landscape. It also makes me think of Virginia Woolf's description of life as a kind of dull cotton wool. And she said, it's a constant idea of mine, and this is a kind of critique of sort of the boredom that she encountered in day-to-day life, that behind the cotton wool is hidden a pattern. She wants to get past it. She says that all human beings are connected with this, that the whole world is a work of art, that we are parts of the work of art. And I've been thinking about that formulation for so long, and it always bugged me, right? It makes me uneasy. And I think the description makes me uneasy because of the metaphor she uses, right? Because behind the cotton wool, of course, were the workers of the wool, right? Assiduous refusal has distorted the stories told of people and places with blankness, right? And that's just another way of setting up my point that I think when the children of those who worked the cotton return, it is a tending and attention and a kind of authorship with ethical commitments. Claiming to repair the past would be arrogant, but care is right. Before cotton cultivation and during and after were other kinds of encounters, a living and dying and breathing in excess of the accounting. If my frequent argument, and I think I'm right, but if it is right that the photographer is a polymath, then the one who takes pictures of the palimpsestic South is engaged in a vexing yet abundant portraiture of place, people, and nation. Each subject and object in their composition tells a piece of our collective regional and national story. Among the tasks is national storyteller. And stories are ethical positions, even when they pretend they're not. They are deliberate with attention, with emphasis, with moral imagination. Now, origins are mystical efforts for storytellers. They're not science, they are art. They will not succumb to formal rules. Origins are wild and varied. To turn to the natural world itself is an ethical position, and even the most exacting orders of the world, there is disruption, and nature speaks to that directly, thank God. Faces, of course, are important, but faceless places are too. So what do we see along the slave trail? We can see the forested land lying along the James, the founding river of these United States. At least that's how it's referred to. The variety of trees are exquisite. Maple, sycamore, beech, the fruit-bearing pawpaw, the tulip tree with cup-like brilliant flowers, river birch, fragrant sweet bay magnolia, and the eastern cottonwood with its floral-looking leaves among them. Colonial towns spring up along the fault lines of rivers, these places where waterfalls and rapids rush, parallel rivers plunging down from a higher elevation, and so it is with the James River and this historically significant city, Richmond, first settled in 1607 by the British, who drove out the Powhatan Confederacy and grew their power and prosperity over generations. Chartered as a city in 1742 and in 1775, host of the Second Virginia Convention. There, Patrick Henry, slaveholder, delivered his famous speech intoning, "Give me liberty or give me death," as others survived the bondage he imposed. Over those same generations, people in coffles, barely clothed, if at all, with bodies that were emaciated, scarred, keloided by hot irons, and sometimes mangled in the ship's throes on that terrible passage across the ocean, were led from the river bank through the forest to slave pens at a place called Shockoe Bottom. The trip was often made at night so as to not disturb delicate sensibilities with their poor condition, and perhaps to not expose the contradiction between promise and deed. The enslaved were herded into the rough dwellings before sale. They were offered some meager food and buttered up to look hardy, but the condition was wholly demoralizing. Locked together with irons and bolts, they understood, as poet Robert Hayden would famously write, that they had voyaged through death to new life on these shores. Richmond's slave trail was an inception point for Black American life and the nation itself. In the images taken along the trail, Dawoud Bey is a polymath and a historian. Unapologetically, he reminds us that captivity is the legacy of our founding river and first colonial settlement. Now you can see that abundance and overgrowth haven't yet erased the imprint of the trail. Footpaths remain through it, but also the trees are younger than you might imagine them to be. This isn't an old-growth forest. Though verdant, wild even, it is apparent that earlier generations of trees were felled, just like the lives of bondspeople, both in the service of the prosperity of the master class and the constitution of the country. What we see out there and in here, in this room, and in this space, this gorgeous museum space, in image and body, are descendants that continuously crop up after destruction. What we have in the photographs is not a place frozen in time, but a site of collective inheritance. Dawoud Bey has been best known, arguably, for portraiture. His subjects, like the ones we see of Birmingham, have wise eyes, old and contemplative souls, even when very young. But of the slave trail photographs, In contrast, we have something environmental. But I would argue that this too is portraiture, a sort of environmental portraiture, one that reveals the obscured side of our Janus-faced nation. On the more familiar side, Richmond is the place where founding fathers gathered and spoke their lofty ambitions. Thomas Jefferson's state capitol facing the water like a beacon, outshining the bloody commerce that was set there. On the other side are the faces that were not drawn and the names that went unwritten, with the exception, I'm sorry, this is just a little aside, but one of the things that I think is so telling about the story of the nation is that, you know, we have this sort of refrain where we talk about how the names of enslaved people were not documented, right? And they're named by sort of rough age and numbers and on property documents. When I started sort of doing genealogy in earnest, I sort of took this for granted until I started looking at wills. And then when in wills, you find often the details of the names of the enslaved in much more detail about them. And they're like runaway notices in that respect. There's remarkable detail. There was remarkable attentiveness, actually, to the bodies and the identities of the enslaved, which actually is not, that doesn't actually diminish the harshness of their fate. In fact, in some ways, it emphasizes how deliberate it was to keep them out of documentation, right? So there was a human recognition of the details of their presence and a decision to keep them out of formal sites of recognition. And so if we have on the one side the place, the famous people with their lofty ambitions, and on the other side, the faces that were not drawn and the names that went unwritten, and despite, you know, often our best efforts genealogically and historically, they remain so. But what we do know with certainty is that Black people were here, many, in the place on the trail. The place itself, hollowed of record, is the marker, right? Now, of course, as I said, we know the faces of the master class. They documented their lives and accounted for properties with papers made of felled birch and maple trees and ink made from the gallnuts of white oak. All of that, the labor, Black hands and muscle. They put names on houses and gravestones, portraits on walls, made often of Black hands and muscle. So the environmental portraits provide another kind of record and witness. The trees that were necessary for the paper and ink have regrown, and the haunting memory of the unfree laborers upon whose back the place was built and whose feet navigated these paths are present, if only ephemeral. See how the evening lengthened shadows appear like outstretched Black arms, moving Black legs, a spectral version of how captives long to move free. One can also see it in the patterns of leaves dappling like music and hear the rustling of wind through branches, the crunch underfoot, feel the heat and scent pressing into one's skin, sense the passing brush of scurrying small animals, the scrape of hard cotton aprons, all by means of the holy light of Silver Point. Catching a likeness of this place is a memorialization, but also a reckoning. Perhaps for a moment, you might transmute the face of a child or an elder onto a body, adorned in tatters, shackled perhaps, or self-emancipated, shoeless, sharp-eyed, the ones who came before the ones who came before the ones we imagine. Along the path of the slave trail, there was once the old burial ground for enslaved people. It was on the eastern side of Chaco Hill, tumbling down to the creek. They were granted neglected, thirsty land. The sheriffs brought Gabriel Prosser here, a blacksmith and a bondsman. Prosser had planned an insurrection of enslaved people in surrounding counties. His plot was discovered in the wake of a terrible rainstorm and a few who betrayed him. He sought liberty and justice for all. He was awarded death. Prosser was executed on the old burial ground in 1800. His bones are most likely somewhere in that ground. In truth, there was no distinction between the gallows and the graveyard when it came to the first African burial ground in Richmond. The unfree were placed in the ground in humble nighttime services, and the convicted were executed and left for dead. It was all of a piece. No dignity even in their journey to the afterlife. So the free community took steps to better honor the dead. Local free people of color formed the Burying Ground Society in 1815, and in 1860 they successfully built a proper graveyard north of Chaco Hill called the Second African Burial Ground, with sections for both slave and free people. Free people placed headstones on graves. The enslaved arranged branches and rocks in decorative patterns to remember where their loved ones were interred. Incidentally, and you all may know this, but those of you who are Virginians may know this, but I'm going to share it because I know that we're from all over the place. If you walk in rural places in this state and you see patches of periwinkle flowers, that's often an indication that enslaved people are buried underneath a ground, that it was, when folks couldn't put headstones down, they often planted periwinkle flowers, which are incredibly hardy. And so it was a way of sustaining awareness of where your people were interred. On the old site, no longer in use after 1860, both a jail and a school for poor white children were placed, and that's all gone now, but that's sort of the palimpsestic space with bodies underneath is a recurrent theme throughout the entire region. One of the places that I write about in South to America is Huntsville, Alabama, where my family is from, and there are there's an arsenal, Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville that lies atop enslaved African people who were buried there beforehand. When the war was over, the Second African Burial Ground became a repository for white rage. A gunpowder magazine was exploded on the site, disinterring bodies. Grave robbers did the same, so they might deliver the black dead to physicians for medical experimentation. Perhaps ironically, it is thought that there are more intact bones in the first burial ground than the second. The detritus remains in the form of ruins and continued racial inequality. To say history is a palimpsest may be insufficient to describe the place, right? It isn't just made of many layers of lives, institutions, and events of the past. It is, in fact, contested ground, a storied landscape that speaks to our battles over who gets to be included in how we tell the story and in how we tell the story itself. Over 300,000 black people were sold in Richmond. The slave trail was well worn, literally and figuratively. It was integral to both the age of expansion and the age of revolution. Ours is a nation founded with bondage at its beginnings through the Revolutionary era in the late 18th and early 19th century, when talk of liberty was feverish. The enslaved were brought into Virginia unfree. Beginning in the 1830s, however, the course changed. A pivot was made to a season of nation building and prosperity on a global stage for the young country. In Richmond, tobacco production was exhausting the soil, and the enslaved population was growing by natural increase. Hence, there were more unfree workers than needed in Virginia, but the country had grown to double its size in previous decades, and there was high demand for slaves in cotton country and on sugar plantations. Put back on the water, the downriver slave trade sent thousands of enslaved people from Richmond to the deeper South all the way up until emancipation. One of the stories I tell in South to America is about finding, I do this genealogical research, and going back, and I find this ancestor, and I have had this sort of in my mind. I want to tell. We have these. I mean, part of the sort of strangeness of genealogy is that it's all sort of mythological, even though it's sort of technical, right? And so, in my head, I had this story I was going to tell about. I'm going to go back, and then eventually, I'm going to find a document, and it'll say someone's name, and it says birthplace Africa, right? And I had, and I was like, it's a sort of romantic story in my head. I know I've studied history for most of my life. Forgive me, because I'm about to say something embarrassing. So I find this ancestor, and it says, this woman named Esther, born in 1769, and it says birthplace Maryland. And I'm like, Maryland, right? Now, the reason why this is sort of absurd, because in my conception of self is so deeply tied to the Deep South. I was confused, even though obviously I know the story of how we got to the Deep South, right? And the story of how we got to the Deep South, my family in particular, is obviously a story of the sort of the internal slave trade, or what sometimes people call the sort of the enslaved African Trail of Tears, right? So it makes sense, coming from a family that were people who were enslaved in the colonial period, that it would go back to, the tree would go back to the Upper South. And that also expanded even my conception, the way I talk and think about the South. I also tell, this is just a quick aside, I'm going to get back on track, but as I tell this quick story, I tell this story about, I had a teacher in high school in Massachusetts who was from Birmingham, but I never thought he was from Birmingham. I assumed that he was from Virginia because he was so erudite and he talked so fancy. But he was actually from Birmingham. So, that's a little, I'm revealing a little bit about myself. Anyway, and I love him. Mr. McCrowland is wonderful. Anyway, where was I? The country had grown to double its size in previous decades, and there was this demand for slaves in cotton country and on sugar plantations, right? So put back on the water, or walking through the landscape, right? The downriver slave trade sent thousands of enslaved people from Richmond to the deeper South, all the way up to emancipation. 1 step forward, 3 steps back, and sometimes the reverse happened. People can get lost in the forest, tripped up by a changing ground cover of perennial struggles. Every student of American history learns that the Founding Fathers gathered in Richmond, and that later the secessionists made it their stronghold, proclaiming that in their defense of slavery, they were actually the ones who sustained the spirit of the American Revolution, right? Richmond has a good deal of shame in its past as well as glory. The founding freedom fighters made their way through Richmond too, and that is perhaps the most glorious legacy of all. A freedom trail that ran alongside the slave trail. In 1849, Henry Box Brown mailed himself to freedom in a stunning feat of fortitude and ingenuity from Richmond, and lived to tell the story of his escape in his public lectures as an abolitionist who provided audiences with a theatrical performance of his body encased in the box before victoriously emerging. Another well-known 19th century black freedman, Anthony Burns, escaped north by way of the James River in 1854. Burns had been hired out to work in Richmond, and his contact with sailors like Frederick Douglass's in Maryland inspired in him a deep yearning for freedom. However, he was a devout Christian who prayed really hard on the question of whether escaping was righteous. It was. After all, he'd been taught Christianity through the lens of the master class, which held his position at the bottom rung of the society as divinely ordained. And Burns read the Bible and noted with disappointment that Hagar had fled from a cruel master, but was commanded by the angel of the Lord to return. And the apostle Paul himself had returned a runaway slave. But that was different because Paul had implored the master to treat Onesimus as a free man. Now, as would happen broadly in the African American theological tradition, despite these examples, Burns found himself seeing freedom as a divine right. As his biographer noted, he came to the conclusion that, quote, there was no passage of Holy Writ by virtue of which Colonel Suttle could claim a right to property in him any more than he could in Colonel Suttle. Paul was on his side. The whole spirit of the gospel sanctioned his desires, and he deliberately dismissed Hagar from his thoughts. From that moment, with a clear conscience and full integrity of Christian character, he applied himself of his inalienable right to liberty and the pursuit of happiness. The ship took him north to Boston and emancipation. The road Burns took was not unlike Paul's, a conversion road to freedom and a theology of liberation, yet Burns found himself returned to slavery due to the notorious Fugitive Slave Act, a federal legislation in 1850 which made no place in this country safe for any victim of chattel slavery, regardless of local law. You can hear that echo in King's statement in 1963, and often in statements we make in 2023 and 2024. No safe place. Taken back to Richmond, he was placed at another important location within walking distance of a river, the old jail. 30 years after Prosser's rebellion was thwarted, the place, remembered as Lumpkin's Jail, had been built at the foot of the hill in Shockoe Bottom, first owned by two different slave traders. Lumpkin, whose name is most associated with the institution, took ownership of the jail in 1844 and housed his own property there, as well as the human chattel of other slave traders for a fee. And this is where Burns was held for 4 months in dismal conditions. Though ultimately his freedom was bought by abolitionist friends, he only lived to age 28, and that may have been attributable to exposure to the elements, improper nutrition, as well as the well-documented physical brutality at the jail. Burns wasn't the only historically significant man to be brought from freedom into slavery at Lumpkin Jail in 1841, Solomon Northrop. A free black man who had been kidnapped and placed in bondage spent a night in the jail. And the next morning, he was driven through the streets of Richmond to the brig Orleans, which was filled with tobacco, and taken down the coast to a slave pen before being sold in New Orleans. Upon regaining his freedom, Northrop would publish the classic narrative, 12 Years a Slave. Both Burns and Henry Box Brown would also become people whose testimonials excited abolitionist energy. Now, we know these few names because they made it out of slavery, right? Many more were put back on boats along the James River where their ancestors had once disembarked as Africans turned slaves. Northrop's 12 years offers a window into that heartbreak. He was sent down to New Orleans along what some historians call the coastwives' slave trade, and he lived his years in bondage along the Red River in New Orleans. Northrop was among those who encountered those unnamed and without faces, who traveled waterways and trails to experience a distinctly cruel iteration of American slavery in the Deep South, where oak and cypress trees break open the land with their massive roots. Thicker trunks, wild indigo, and cane brakes that are now laced with petrochemicals provide Dawoud Bey with yet another form of environmental portraiture. The river road of Louisiana that he captures is darker and more entangled than the slave trail of Richmond, but no less beautiful or devastating. Down South the old-growth trees suffer from new problems rooted in the same old misuse and disregard. I myself have a cypress tree tattooed on my back as a reminder that there are roots older than this nation-state. History, like the waters, is arterial. The Lumpkin Jail is the Birmingham Jail, is the Angola Plantation Prison, is Parchment State Penitentiary, is the fields of cotton and the new environmental hazards. The past pumps itself into our bloodstreams, and yet we continue making generations, to borrow language from Gail Jones. I suppose that is the greatest lesson of all of these images. They excite the imagination. We marvel at their beauty, and in our mind's eye or yearning hearts, we people them with what we know happened in that terrible lushness to Black people, we who have indeed been here since the disastrous beginning. The first have been kept last. The wrong has yet to be fully righted. So train your eye on this place, these faces, and keep your hand on history's plow. Hold on.